Once upon a time, near the quiet edge of a sprawling green forest, there stood a humble cottage, wrapped in winding ivy and surrounded by wild herbs and blossoming flowers, where the scent of rosemary and thyme drifted through warm breezes, and every sunset painted the home in golden light, as if day itself lingered there a moment longer to admire its simple beauty. Within its walls lived a widow and her two daughters, Clarice and Marianne. Clarice the elder bore her mother's sharp features, sharper tongue, and a heart hardened by vanity and pride, pleased only by her reflection in any shiny surface she could find. Marianne, gentle as still waters, tended their garden with soft hands stained by earth and carried in her eyes the quiet kindness that once lit their father's face. Though they lived under the same roof, favoritism cut the household into two worlds. Clarice was showered with praise and finery, ribbons and lace even when bread was scarce, while Marianne wore dresses patched and repatched, her life defined by the work no one else wished to do, fetching water, washing clothes, gathering firewood, keeping the house alive with her labor. And yet, she answered every scolding with humility, guarding her heart with patience, because kindness was the only armor she owned. One sweltering afternoon, beneath a sky so bright it burned the eyes, the widow discovered their water was gone, and barked orders at Marianne to fetch fresh water from the farthest well, nearly a mile away through briars and dust, because only that well pleased her. Without complaint, Marianne tied a kerchief over her hair, lifted the largest jug, and set off beneath the blazing sun, her shoes kicking up tiny clouds of dust, while bees hummed sleepily over wildflowers. By the time she reached the ancient stone well, with its edges worn smooth by years and its shadows smelling of cool earth, Marianne was trembling with fatigue. She lowered the bucket, filled her jug, and sat to rest as the heat shimmered across the fields. In that quiet, she heard a frail voice ask for water. An elderly woman stood nearby, parched and weary, and without hesitation, Marianne rinsed her jug clean again, drew fresh water, and offered it as though giving something precious from the depths of her heart. The old woman drank gratefully and declared that few souls held such pure kindness without seeking reward. As Marianne blinked in confusion, the woman's shape dissolved into silver radiance, her ragged clothes melting into a gown woven from starlight. Wings glimmered from her shoulders as she transformed into a fairy whose voice chimed like distant bells. She blessed Marianne, declaring that from this day forth, every word she spoke would bring forth flowers and jewels, the outer reflection of her inner goodness, and urged her to speak with care, because kindness, once spoken, could change the world. Before Marianne could give thanks, the fairy vanished like mist rising into sunlight, leaving Marianne half frozen with awe. She hurried home, unsure and frightened but hopeful. When she apologized for taking so long, diamonds and roses spilled from her lips, rolling across the floor and blooming into beauty. Clarice screamed in shock while the widow dove after the riches, greed burning hot in her eyes. As Marianne nervously recounted how the magic blessing came to be, sapphires, violets, pearls, and lilies fell with every word, piling into glittering mounds that made the widow's breath quicken with lust for wealth. The widow wasted no time, commanding Clarice to seek the same blessing, insisting she behave kindly to anyone along the way. Though Clarice detested the idea of walking so far, especially to fetch water like a servant, she could not ignore the diamonds flashing in her mother's hands, and so she set off in her finest dress, muttering complaints beneath her breath and cursing the sun that dared burn her perfect skin. Upon reaching the well, sweaty and annoyed, she encountered the fairy again, now disguised as a radiant princess, and when asked politely for water, Clarice scoffed and refused, declaring she would not serve strangers. With sorrowful justice, the fairy blessed her according to her heart. With cruelty came curse instead of fortune. Clarice rolled her eyes and stomped away, unaware that consequences follow such selfishness swiftly when magic listens. Clarice strutted home, Her chin lifted despite the heat that plastered her hair to her forehead and soaked her fine dress in sweat, rehearsing in her mind the praise she expected to receive for enduring such a dreadful errand, imagining already the piles of jewels pouring out with every word she would speak. But when her mother rushed toward her at the door and demanded to know if she had met the mysterious lady at the well, Clarice snapped impatiently that some old fool had begged for water, but she had sent her away, because she was not about to act like some servant fetching drinks for strangers. As she spat these words, a cold weight thudded onto the floor between them, and Clarice stared in confused horror as a fat, warty toad crawled from her lips, followed by another and another, each creature landing with a wet slap and beginning to hop through the cottage, as her every complaint produced more slime-covered beasts that croaked and wriggled and left trails of muck wherever they moved. The widow shrieked in disbelief and terror, swatting at the creatures as they leapt toward her skirts. And when Clarice tried to tell her mother to do something, a small, hissing snake slid from her mouth, coiling angrily on the floor, its tongue flicking as if tasting both the air and Clarice's humiliation. Panic spread like sickness through the room. Clarice, clutching her throat as though she could force the toads back into silence, her mother stumbling outside in fright, blaming Marianne for ruining everything and screaming accusations that pierced the air like sharp thorns. Marianne, devastated and trembling, insisted she had done nothing wrong, that all she ever wanted was to do good. But her mother's rage was a force already beyond reason, and in her bitterness she drove Marianne away from the house, shoving her down the steps and shouting that she had brought only misery upon them with her cursed kindness. And if she still wished to fill the world with flowers, then let her go, bloom somewhere else. Marianne's heart cracked inside her chest as she looked upon the home she had tended with love every day of her life, knowing she was being cast aside not for wrongdoing, but because her goodness shone where envy could not tolerate light. Tears blurred her vision as she stepped onto the dusty road, the jug still hanging from her trembling fingers, but she forced herself to keep walking, her sorrow silent except for the soft, clinking sound of a few pearls rolling from her lips as quiet sobs escaped her. Alone on the path, she wandered toward the edge of the forest, unsure where she could possibly go, the shadows lengthening as the sun dipped toward the horizon, her thoughts heavy with the belief that perhaps kindness did not protect her after all. Yet beneath that pain still flickered a small, stubborn hope that somewhere beyond this heartbreak lay a place where she would be seen for who she truly was and loved without condition. It was along this lonely road that a grand carriage suddenly appeared, drawn by white stallions whose hooves struck the earth with elegant certainty, and bearing a golden crest that glinted like fire in the fading sunlight, signaling the presence of royalty. Inside sat the prince of the realm, returning from a day's hunt, his thoughts still wandering the stillness of the forest, when he caught sight of a girl walking alone with tears glistening on her cheeks. He ordered the driver to halt, stepped from the carriage, and approached her with genuine concern, asking softly if she was lost or in any kind of danger. Marianne lowered her gaze, murmuring that she was fine, only swallowed by sorrow. And with that gentle admission, a cascade of tiny lilies and pearls fell from her lips, landing like secrets revealed to the world at her feet. The prince froze in awe, his eyes widening as though he had glimpsed a miracle unfolding right before him. He knelt to study the jewels and flowers, but found himself even more captivated by Marianne's modest posture, her soft voice, and her sorrow hidden beneath grace. He encouraged her to speak more, and as she explained only pieces of her story, beauty continued spilling from her
you are
words,
welcome to the
proving
flowers
that
and
her
the
very
gems.
breath carried magic
I have no need
that made
for
the
them.
world around her shimmer and transform. The prince, struck by the purity of her heart and the quiet wonder she held, extended his hand and told her that someone with a gift so extraordinary should never walk the world alone in grief, that she deserved a place where her kindness would be cherished, and that he wished to escort her to the palace so the king and queen could meet the maiden of flowers and jewels. Hesitant, nervous, and unfamiliar with such unexpected warmth, Marianne searched his expression and found not curiosity or greed, but true compassion, a rare quality she could sense, the same way a flower senses sunlight. And slowly she placed her hand into his. They rode toward the palace with the evening breeze cooling the sadness still clinging to her heart, while the prince listened quietly, offering comfort simply by being present, making the silence between their words feel safe rather than cold. As they arrived, the palace rose before them like a world carved out of dreams. Tall towers and marble arches glowing silver beneath the early stars, while guards and courtiers hurried about with lively steps that echoed through vast stone halls. Marianne felt small beneath the towering pillars and chandeliers, overwhelmed by the grandness of everything. But when she greeted the king and queen with shy respect, diamonds rolled from her mouth and danced across the polished floor like tiny fallen stars. The courtiers gasped, some even falling to their knees in reverence, for never had they seen such gentle enchantment. The queen's eyes softened at once toward Marianne, seeing behind the magic a soul unspoiled by vanity, and the king's stern demeanor melted into wonder as he studied the marvel that kindness had bestowed. The prince, already smitten with her humility and grace, declared boldly that he wished for her to remain, that she was someone destined to bring joy into their lives and light into the kingdom itself. Marianne felt her heart flutter with disbelief, not daring to trust such happiness, but the king, wise enough to recognize sincerity in his son's voice, nodded and announced that if Marianne wished, she would be welcomed not as a guest, but as the prince's future bride, because a woman whose very words made the world more beautiful was exactly the kind of queen who could teach all hearts to flourish. Marianne's answer emerged through tears of astonished gratitude, and with every trembling word, flowers of soft pastel colors unfolded on the air around her. Proof that even in overwhelming emotion, her gift carried only beauty. Meanwhile, back in the village, the widow and Clarice faced the consequences of their cruelty. The cottage that had once smelled of herbs and warm bread now reeked of damp earth and decay, overrun by toads and snakes that emerged from Clarice's every complaint. The villagers avoided them in fear and disgust, whispering that they were cursed by dark magic, and soon even the widow could no longer tolerate the constant croaking and slithering that filled her home. Desperation gnawed at her heart, but instead of recognizing her own fault, she blamed Marianne for abandoning them in their misery. Her greed now twisted into madness that left her pacing the cottage with empty eyes, clutching the jewels Marianne once produced, but finding no joy in them at all. Riches gave no comfort when love had been chased away. Clarice, once so proud and full of herself, now lived in constant horror of opening her mouth. Knowing her words had turned into living nightmares, and the more she cursed her fate, the more foul creatures emerged, until the house itself seemed alive with writhing chaos. Unable to bear it further, the widow pushed Clarice out and demanded she never return, unless she could rid herself of the curse. But with no one willing to help her, and no heart willing to change, Clarice wandered into the darkness of the forest, her sobs echoing through branches where even the owls refused to answer, each cry birthing more hissing, croaking, slimy reminders of the ugliness she had nurtured within. Clarice stumbled deeper into the forest, trembling as dusk thickened around her, each step driven not by purpose, but by terror of the toads and snakes that fell from her lips whenever she dared to speak. And though she tried to keep silent, she could not stop the sobs that rose in her throat like thorns, birthing more crawling creatures that leapt away into the damp undergrowth. The shadows of the trees stretched long and twisted, branches creaking like ancient bones, and somewhere far behind her, the faint glimmer of her former home vanished beneath night's heavy curtain, leaving nothing but darkness and the consequences of her own cruelty. Breath-hitching, she cried for her mother, but even that plea turned into a writhing snake that plopped onto the leaves, and with each creature she produced, her fear grew. until Clarice felt as though the forest itself rejected her presence. The villagers who once admired her beauty now shunned her completely, refusing even to look into her eyes for fear a frog might leap out. Clarice, who once adored her reflection, no longer wished to see her own face, for now she perceived ugliness not upon her skin, but growing like a poisonous weed from her very heart. Meanwhile, the widow sat alone in her cottage, surrounded by jewels that once promised a future of comfort and prestige, but now glittered coldly beneath the flicker of a dying fire. She clutched diamonds to her chest, whispering that they should bring her joy. But joy does not answer greed, and riches do not speak warmth into a heart frozen by selfishness. She paced wildly through the house, calling for Marianne, as though the girl she had cast out would suddenly reappear to fix the emptiness inside. But only silence responded, and the silence was more frightening than any toad could ever be. Her wealth mocked her, piles of gems lying useless on the table where bread should have been, and loneliness followed her like a relentless shadow. She cursed fate, cursed magic, cursed kindness. But never once did she curse the flaws within herself, and so her bitterness swallowed her whole, turning her world into a prison built by her own hands. Far away in the palace, a very different world blossomed. Marianne, once scolded for daydreaming, now lived in a place where her dreams could finally breathe and grow like endless gardens. Every morning she woke in silk sheets embroidered with golden vines, but she never allowed luxury to change the tenderness of her heart. Servants marveled at her, not for the jewels and flowers her words produced, but for the way she thanked them with genuine warmth no queen had ever shown. When she spoke to the maids, daisies dropped gently to the floor, and the maids would gather them with smiles, weaving the blossoms into braids that decorated Marianne's room like living artwork. The prince watched her more closely each day, admiring not only her magical gift, but her gentle humility. How she would kneel to pick up a dropped handkerchief, even when a servant rushed to do it first. How she would comfort a frightened animal, or pause to admire the quiet beauty of falling leaves. He found himself falling deeply in love with her, not because her words made the world sparkle, but because her kindness made it softer. Marianne, though unsure at first, soon grew to trust him, drawn to his steady goodness and sincere admiration, and her heart, long deprived of affection, opened like a blossom seeking sun. When the king announced that Marianne and the prince were to be wed, the kingdom erupted in celebration. The people cheered for the maiden of flowers and jewels, believing she must surely be a blessing sent to ensure prosperity for generations. And indeed the kingdom began to change, as though Marianne's goodness flowed beyond her lips and into the very soil. Gardens flourished even in seasons that once saw drought. The air grew sweeter, and acts of kindness spread like a new form of wealth that no one wished to hoard. Children would rush to her in the palace courtyard, eager to hear her speak, not for the gemstones, but for the comfort and encouragement in her voice. She lifted spirits simply by existing, her presence a gentle reminder that goodness, when nurtured, radiates far beyond the heart it lives in. As preparations for her wedding began, Marianne often wandered the palace gardens, remembering the rosemary-scented cottage where she had spent her days in toil and silence, missing even the smallest bits of love she once hoped to find there. She wondered what had become of her mother and sister, whether they were well, whether they might one day realize that love mattered more than wealth or vanity. Sometimes she would speak to the prince about her family, lilies falling onto the grass with every soft mention of their names, and he would assure her that perhaps time still held a chance for their redemption. But time shows kindness only to those willing to seek it. Clarice, lost within the forest, had grown thin and hollow-eyed. Her fine dress, now torn and filthy as thorns, snagged its fabric and leaves tangled in her hair. Days blurred as she wandered desperately, unable to ask for help because every spoken word summoned horrors from her mouth. Hunger gnawed at her gut, and thirst scraped down her throat like sand. But whenever she tried to beg for aid, the sight of the creatures emerging repelled anyone who might have helped. One by one, people who had once been eager to admire her beauty now closed their doors against her. And Clarice soon understood what Marianne had endured her entire life: rejection, mockery, loneliness. But where Marianne met cruelty with patience, Clarice's heart had only pride to shield it. And pride cannot survive without admiration. Eventually, even her pride crumbled, leaving her with nothing but the bitter ashes of regret. Back in the village, the widow's obsession grew into madness. She hoarded the jewels until her fingers bled from clutching them too tightly, muttering that Marianne should have returned home with even more. Blinded to the truth that it was her own cruelty that drove Marianne away. Her home, once kept tidy by Marianne's hard work, fell to ruin. Dust thickened on surfaces, the hearth turned cold and unused, and the garden wilted without Marianne's loving care. Without anyone to blame but herself, the widow still found a way to curse Marianne's name each night before collapsing into restless sleep. Yet no wealth nor denial could soothe her loneliness, and day by day her heart withered until she became a ghost of the woman she once was. In contrast, the palace thrived. Marianne, treated now with the love she had always deserved, prepared for her wedding to the prince. The gown she would wear shimmered like woven moonlight, and flowers bloomed wherever she walked without her needing to utter a word. The court eagerly awaited the celebration, grateful for the gentle influence she had brought into the kingdom's culture. Acts of kindness became a new fashion among nobles, generosity a new language, compassion a new currency. Marianne often stood at the highest balcony, gazing into the kingdom she would soon help rule, thanking whatever grace of the world had led her from despair to this breathtaking life. She did not know that far below, in the forest, Clarice still wandered aimlessly, muttering curses that only spawned more ugly beasts which slithered into the leaf litter. And each day, Clarice disappeared further from the memory of those who once knew her. Some would later whisper that she was consumed by the forest, turned into nothing more than a cautionary tale that croaked from the mouths of frogs near the well whenever a traveller approached. As for the widow, her final days were consumed by greed. One cold winter night, she sat hunched over her dwindling hoard, her breath shallow and her fingers trembling so violently that the jewels clinked together with nervous whispers. She clutched them tighter, but the warmth of life had already begun to leave her body. Riches cannot buy forgiveness, nor mend hearts that have been broken by their own selfish hands. She died there alone beside a hearth that carried no fire, surrounded by treasures that offered no comfort, and when her body was found, not a single tear was shed in sorrow. For she had chosen wealth over love, power over kindness, and in the end all of it left her empty. When the day of the royal wedding finally arrived, the palace awoke before dawn, bustling with life and excitement as the first light cast a gentle pearl glow upon the towers. Bells chimed across the kingdom, echoing through hills and forests as if the land itself celebrated the union of the prince and the maiden whose kindness had transformed her fate. Marianne stood before a polished mirror, though she scarcely recognized the figure reflected back. Draped in a gown more radiant than moonbeams, the veil upon her head soft as morning mist. Her hair adorned not by jewels forged by men, but by flowers that bloomed from her very presence. Petals shimmering with dew that fell from her footsteps like delicate blessings. She took a breath, remembering how just months ago she had walked dusty roads burdened by sorrow, never daring to imagine such joy could be hers. The palace servants marveled at her serenity, watching as daisies and tiny silver bells fell from her lips when she whispered her gratitude for their help. Each blossom a testament to the goodness that flowed from her heart without force or intention. The prince, equally adorned in ceremonial attire of deep royal blue embroidered with gold, waited in the grand hall where beams of sunlight poured through stained glass windows, painting his features with shifting rainbows. His pulse quickened, not with the nerves of royalty, but with the anticipation of standing forever beside a woman whose gentle soul had already reshaped his world. When Marianne appeared, escorted by the queen who had come to love her as a daughter, the court fell into a hush that lingered like reverence in the air, their breaths taken by her grace. By the way, she carried herself with humility, despite the magic that sparkled at her every word. The ceremony unfolded with solemn beauty, the vows spoken softly but clearly, each promise accompanied by blooming petals that drifted like snowflakes of spring. When the crown was placed upon Marianne's head, and she was declared the beloved princess and future queen of the realm, the hall erupted in cheers and applause that surged like waves crashing on shore. And Marianne felt warmth bloom inside her, brighter than sunlight, richer than gold, purer than pearls. She looked at the prince, who gazed back with eyes filled with unwavering devotion, and she understood in that moment that love rooted in kindness grows stronger than any spell. The celebration carried into the days that followed, with feasts laid out on long tables and music drifting through the palace courtyards as the people rejoiced in the hope their new princess brought. Marianne and the prince walked among them, greeting every soul, from noble to child to shepherd, with equal kindness. And though jewels still fell from her lips, they were no longer hoarded or treasured, but shared freely with those in need. The magic that once surprised her became a gift she gracefully used to help others. She filled the coffers for the poor, restored broken homes, and ensured that no family went hungry when winter howled at their door. Under her tender influence, the kingdom flourished in ways no one had imagined possible. Fields yielding abundant harvests, streams running clear and lively, and flowers blooming out of season, as though the earth itself had learned the language of her heart. Children throughout the land grew up hearing tales of the princess whose voice could make gardens grow and sorrow fade. And in their laughter Marianne found the purest joy she had ever known. Yet even in prosperity, she never forgot the pain of being unloved, the ache of longing for kindness from those who should have given it freely. In quiet moments, she thought of her mother and sister, wondering if their hearts had changed, if regret had softened the hardness that once resided there. The prince, wise in love, told her that some souls do not learn until kindness is gone from their reach, yet Marianne still hoped that somewhere, somehow, forgiveness might bloom even in hearts once choked by greed. But life writes every chapter according to truth, not wishes. The widow's life had ended in lonely despair, and Clarice, wandering endlessly as a cautionary ghost of her own cruelty, faded from the world's memory like a stone sinking beneath murky waters, leaving behind only rumors and fearful stories told by frightened villagers. Some claimed that if one ventured too close to the old well, frogs would croak her name in rasping whispers, warning that bitterness brings misery, and that a heart without love becomes its own punishment. Marianne chose to honor the past, not with bitterness, but with compassion. She ruled beside the prince with wisdom and tenderness, her words, whether adorned with diamonds or the sweetest petals, becoming seeds that sprouted kindness in every corner of the kingdom. Her children grew up knowing that greatness was not measured by crowns or coin, but by how gently one treated the world, and that a single act of compassion could alter the path of fate. They learned that words are heavier than stones, capable of building or breaking, blessing or cursing, and so they spoke always with intention and grace. Marianne herself never saw her magic as anything more than a reminder that who we are on the inside finds its way into the world, no matter how fiercely we try to hide or deny it. And so the years passed in peace and prosperity. The prince and his fairy-blessed bride grew into a legacy that outlived their days. For kindness spreads like sunlight across a horizon, warming even the hearts that believed themselves cold, illuminating roads once dark, turning fear into hope. Travelers to this kingdom returned with stories of the queen whose voice made the earth bloom, who greeted every living being as though they mattered, who reminded all that beauty is not worn but born from the soul. The fairy who had once appeared at the well was never seen again, but Marianne often felt a gentle presence on the wind, a soft perfume of roses lingering where no flowers grew. Whenever she spoke a word of comfort or offered compassion to a stranger. It comforted her to imagine that the fairy still watched from afar, pleased not by the jewels that fell from Marianne's lips, but by the love that continued to flow from her heart. Through every season, through triumph and challenge alike, Marianne lived the truth the fairy had gifted her: kindness, though quiet, holds a power stronger than envy, greed, or vanity. And while beauty fades and wealth can crumble like dust beneath ruin, a gentle heart endures, shining brighter than diamonds, blossoming longer than flowers. Her story remained a reminder for all generations that goodness, no matter how small, transforms the world. Even a single sip of water shared with grace can change the course of a life. And so the kingdom bloomed, not from jewels or magic alone, but from the simple, eternal truth that kindness is the rarest and richest treasure of all, forever turning everyday souls into legends whispered from one heart to another. Long after the last petal has fallen from the flower,